Physical neglect is an epidemic in our nation and around the world. This presentation will give the audience the opportunity to see the symptomology of physical neglect, how to identify it, and help us to remember what steps to take to report physical neglect. And it shouldn't hurt to be a child. Physical neglect traumatizes children and adolescents for a lifetime. The basic human needs include having food, water, shelter, clothing, and safety. As people grow and develop, their needs change over time, and they develop further as well. However, when basic human needs are not met for children, they live in a life of unpredictable circumstances and chaos. As these children develop into adolescence and then transition into adulthood, they take this trauma with them, lurking to remind them of what they lived through as children. The purpose of this presentation is to inform the audience about physical neglect and how it affects not only the caregivers and the family, but the children especially. There are many symptoms of physical neglect, even though it's harder to identify sometimes than physical abuse. Physical neglect is the failure to provide shelter, food, clothing, or appropriate supervision for the person's age, physical condition, mental ability, and environment. Caregivers of children and adolescents have an enormous responsibility in their upbringing. When caregivers fail to meet the basic needs of their children or adolescents, those caregivers are physically neglecting them. It is sometimes difficult to identify physical neglect because the symptoms aren't always visible. Physical neglect comes in many when basic needs are not met, it is difficult for them to place academics as a priority for them because they are simply in survival mode. When a child is in survival mode, it is difficult for them to focus on anything but where their next meal is coming from or where they will lay their heads that night. The World Health Organization estimates that as many as 40 million children are abused in any given year. That is such a sad statistic. Child maltreatment and abuse are important social and medical problems. Victims of abuse are susceptible of dangerous short and long-term adverse consequences, such as mental and medical health issues. For this reason, it is essential to keep some very important points in mind when screening children for physical neglect. For example, avoid asking leading questions. Stay with factual, informative questions, avoiding bias and leading the child or adolescent to answer in a specific way. Pay close attention to the child when interviewing them because nonverbal communication will tell the interviewer more information than what the child or adolescent actually verbalizes. Note the child's voice changes, eye contact, breathing patterns, and change of subject when describing situations or people. It is important to remember that it is the responsibility of the clinician to respect the child and adolescent and to only ask questions to gain factual information. When screening for neglect, having a simple conversation about the child's day will shed light to the interviewer on how they are taken care of, who takes care of them, who they play with, how they interact with the people in their lives. This information will help to accurately identify possible cases of physical neglect. In Arizona, mandated reporters include teachers, clinicians, therapists, doctors, and any professional who interacts with children or adolescents. Mandated reporters are required to report any suspicion of abuse or neglect to the proper authorities. In my experience as a teacher, I report the circumstances to my principal, school counselor, and school resource officer. However, ultimately, it is my responsibility to report the circumstances to Child Protective Services. This responsibility must be taken seriously and with follow-through. If a child entrusts a person with the details of neglect, that person owes it to that child to report the circumstances to the Arizona Department of Child Safety. It's the law. On this slide, you will find the phone number for the Arizona Child Abuse Hotline, as well as the Arizona Department Child Safety link to the actual website to report any abuse or neglect. Addressing vicarious trauma. This is a difficult one. When clinicians are entrusted with the details of a traumatic event that a child has experienced, that clinician may have emotions and feelings surface that they weren't expecting. Feeling trauma vicariously is an issue that every clinician must address. Vicarious trauma is the experience of absorbing others' pain in time of their distress so deeply that it affects your own well-being. How can clinicians stay grounded in their current reality rather than impede on their own mental health when dealing with patients who have experienced trauma? When listening to a person's traumatic experience, rather than soaking in every detail of the event, allow the information to flow straight through you, gathering information, but not taking on the pain as your own. This is going to be very important for me to remember as a school counselor, and I have in fact been working on this issue for years. I was raised, neglected, and abused, both in childhood as well as adolescence. If I don't allow traumatic events of others to just flow straight through me, I will become overwhelmed with emotion of the person sharing. To be an effective advocate for children, I will need to practice strategies so that vicarious trauma does not affect my own mental health. Now, when people choose to work with children, they take on the responsibility to not only advocate for them, but to protect them from harm. Physical neglect is an epidemic that affects millions of children and adolescents every year. Children should only be concerned with one thing: growing up in happiness, seeking out their own sources of joy and fulfillment. Without basic needs taken care of, children and adolescents cannot focus on working towards their futures. Rather, they are only concerned with surviving, making it from one meal to the next, not knowing where they will lay their heads down that night. Children and adolescents will be drawn to people in their lives that will help them when they are struggling. If a child entrusts you with information that hurts them, they are silently crying for help. Help them. It's not only the law, but the right thing to do.